This is 8 Minutes, a podcast helping you understand the energy transition in just a few minutes. I'm your host, Paul Schuster. According to the International Energy Agency, global energy-related CO2 emissions for this past year were around 36.8 gigatons. And even though that could have been much worse if there hadn't been an enormous surge in renewable power generation, that raw CO2 number keeps going up. We added globally about 321 million more tons of CO2 into the Earth's atmosphere in 2022 than we did in 21. Renewable energy, electrification, energy efficiency. I spend a lot of time on this podcast talking about ways to reduce the carbon getting into the air in the first place. But it's kind of obvious that we need some solutions for removing the carbon that's already there. So in today's episode, we're going to talk about carbon capture. Pros, the cons, and the big investments being made into this space. 8 minutes. It's how long it takes the sun's race to hit Earth, or, speaking of space, about 4 times longer than SpaceX's recent launch of their Starship super rocket before it exploded. Kinda analogous to Elon's Twitter deal, right? Let's get it on. Not all of our energy transition goals are going to be met by pivoting to electrification and renewable power. Huge swaths of our industrial economy, whether it's cement or steel or just about any other huge industrial thermal load, is going to emit harmful greenhouse gas emissions. For that matter, there's a huge amount of CO2 already in our atmosphere, and we're going to need a way to start removing CO2, not just lowering the amount that we insert each year. Carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration, commonly abbreviated as CCUS, is one way that we're trying to engineer our way out of this problem. And there are basically 3 different avenues that the industry typically looks at. The first, and most straightforward, is through nature-based solutions such as planting trees or other natural carbon sinks. Heard of the Trillion Tree Campaign? That project is aimed at planting a lot of trees in order to start sucking up all of that excess carbon in our atmosphere. Trees are low-cost, easy solutions, but they do have challenges. For one, they take up a bunch of space. A trillion trees would require upwards of 4 times the size of the United States. And second, they aren't super effective. One tree can only store about 21 kilograms of carbon per year. And if that tree is ever cut down and, heaven forbid, burned, that carbon goes right back into the atmosphere. It's hardly a permanent solution. Carbon capture technology, though, may prove to be a bit more durable, and companies are pursuing 2 different types of CCUS to help decarbonize our heavy industries. The first is point source carbon capture, where the technology is located at the flue stack of a furnace or coal facility and captures the carbon directly at the source. This can be highly effective because the carbon's so concentrated at that one point. But that solution is limited a bit because it needs to be co-located with the carbon emitting facility and frankly may not have a ton of options in what it's going to do with the carbon afterwards. The other solution then is called direct air capture, where the capture facility can be located just about anywhere and grabs stray CO2 molecules directly from the ambient air. These facilities then could be placed near big underground storage reservoirs and more efficiently bury the CO2 in these repositories and lock them away. The downside? The density of CO2 at a flue stack can be 10 to 25% of the volume of the air coming out, whereas the ambient air further away can see CO2 levels drop to about 0.4%. Neither solution is right or wrong. It's just 2 sides of the coin. Do you emphasize the capture part of the equation around point source capture or the storage part and lean towards direct air capture? The technologies are a bit different between the 2 as well. Point source capture typically uses a fluid solution filled with amines. These chemicals bind to CO2 at a low temperature and then release the CO2 at higher temperatures. The solution cycles between low and high temperature conditions, dropping off carbon dioxide as it goes. Direct air capture may be more analogous to an air filter, where the air is passed through a sorbent that binds with the carbon. And once that sorbent is filled, the intake's closed and the filter is heated in order for the sorbent to release the CO2, which can then be independently captured. But once that carbon dioxide is captured, what do we do with it? The utilization and sequestration part. For utilization, the options are kind of limited. There's actually not a ton of commercial uses for carbon, aside from carbonation for soda drinks or beer, maybe some applications for dry ice or even carbon fiber manufacturing. The problem with some of those uses, though, is that once you pop that can of Diet Coke, that CO2 is just being released back into the atmosphere. So we're not really permanently removing the carbon to begin with. And frankly, the market for those products is so small that it hasn't really justified the investment into expensive CCUS technologies yet. Overwhelmingly, the big commercial market for carbon utilization is something called enhanced oil recovery, EOR. I hope to talk about this a bit more in a future podcast, but the general thesis is that oil companies have found that they can get a lot more oil out of a well if they pump CO2 down to the bottom of the well and sort of squeeze extra oil out. The CO2 in this case gets sequestered into the porous rock where oil was before, but, well, there's a long conversation we should have around the trade-offs of CO2 for more oil. The other option for carbon capture companies is to simply store the CO2 geologically. Sequestration happens by injecting the carbon dioxide deep into layers of rock. Ideally, the layer of rock that works best is porous enough to where it can absorb the CO2, but that layer lies underneath a separate layer of shale or non-porous formation. That shale rock acts as something of a cap and keeps the CO2 from simply working its way back to the surface and re-entering the atmosphere. Storage solutions, though, don't have any economic revenues attached to them. Aside from some carbon offsets through the voluntary or compliance markets, if we're going to advance storage solutions, then there needs to be some form of state-sponsored incentive to make that happen. That, though, is occurring. Germany and Norway, for instance, agreed earlier this year to cooperate on CCUS technologies and incentives. Germany, for one, saw its portion of coal facility usage surge after Russian gas supplies were drastically reduced due to the war in Ukraine. And the US has put some serious dollars behind CCUS as well. The Inflation Reduction Act extended the 45Q tax credits for CCUS, and the IIJA funneled $8 billion towards these technologies. And the EU has committed upwards of 10 billion euros towards similar implementation. While the technology is relatively nascent today, there's a lot of money flowing into this space. The International Energy Agency reflects that CCUS must play a big role in meeting climate reduction goals. Today, carbon capture only grabs about 40 million metric tons of carbon per year. According to the IEA, that number needs to jump up to 1.6 gigatons by 2030 and to 7.6 gigatons by 2050. And some of those projects are starting to take shape. Climeworks recently completed the largest direct air capture facility in the world in Iceland, capturing 4,000 tons of carbon per year and sequestering it underground. To give perspective, that's about 162,000 equivalent trees. But even that's still not a lot. 4,000 tons of carbon is similar to 790 cars, or to really put it into perspective, we would need 400,000 of these Climeworks facilities to get to the 1.6 gigaton goal by 2030. Still, despite its relatively immaturity, carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration will need to play a big role in the energy transition. There's a lot of controversy on the technology around its current costs to deploy and its application in commercial end use cases such as enhanced oil recovery. But governments and private industry are betting big that costs will come down and that new end markets, such as voluntary offsets or compliance markets, will emerge to drive a revenue stream for these projects. In fact, PitchBook says that $13.8 billion in venture funding went to carbon and emissions-related technologies just last year. It's an important space that's getting a lot of attention. I'm Paul Schuster, and this has been your 8 Minutes.